Good morning, Pat. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm truthfully feeling a little foggy and griefy today. Was reflecting a little bit on Children's Grief Awareness Month, and of course, that's where a lot of my grief experiences come from my own childhood, losing a couple father figures. So, just preparing for this talk today, I was doing a little journaling and just thinking about, wow, like I really I really enjoy, and it's really important for me to talk about this topic of kids and grief because I think it's often overlooked. So I'm excited to dive into that today.
Well, do you want to start sharing some of your thoughts and, that type of thing first, or how do you want to play this out today?
Sure, yeah, we can dive in to that. I was just on children's, what is it? Children's Grief Awareness Day.org, which is cool. There's a little website for it, and it just speaks to the awareness and the movement that they're hoping to establish for just bringing awareness to the impact and offering opportunities to support kids in grief. So for the month of for the month of November is National Children's Grief Awareness Month. And on November 21st, which for us is on Thursday, is the day dedicated for National Children's Grief Awareness. And they say that everyone should wear blue. That's the color. So I think that's cool. A part of their movement, from what I was reading on their website, is to get that into like school systems and areas where, of course, kids are hanging out so that they just feel recognized and feel less alone.
Yeah.
So I was doing a little reflecting on just my experiences and how my early childhood grief experiences have shaped the way that I view the world and the way that I live my life, and of course the work that I do as a grief coach. So I just wanted to share a little bit about that here before we talk into some of your experiences and perspectives too.
hmm
So the first thing that I read on this website that hit me was before high school graduation, 1 out of every 20 children will have a parent die. And that's not even including sibling loss, grandparent loss, other caretakers, other people that are close with them, peers, kids die all the time. And so I just was reflecting on that number, like 1 out of 20 kids experience a parent death. And in my experience in school, I don't know any other kid who had a parent who died. And I was just
Oh,
thinking
yeah.
about, out of the hundreds of kids that I was going to school with, there had to have been statistically other kids who have experienced what I was going through, yet I didn't know anybody. So, what this website was talking about, and something that I can resonate with, is just how, firstly, that kids in grief feel so alone. They feel like their struggles are invisible, like nobody can really understand them. And I remember that feeling walking down, the hallway in school, feeling like everybody knew what had happened. They were all staring at me. They had no idea how to be friends with me, because they knew that my dad had died. So backing up a little bit, I was in the 6th grade when my dad died, and I was the new kid in school, so I already had a hard time making friends. But then my dad died in January, and I remember my English teacher had the whole English class write me sympathy cards, and she came to his funeral and delivered all these cards from the students. And so everybody knew about it. And I think that increased my level of social anxiety coming back to school, knowing that all of my peers and classmates knew what had happened. And because they knew what had happened and couldn't relate to it, I felt like they just did not know how to interact with me. They didn't know how to
hmm
relate with me. And it was like, I almost felt kind of like shunned, or like I had like a disease or like a big note on my
Leprosy.
forehead.
Yeah.
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 That's what it felt like for me, just feeling so alone and feeling so othered. So that statistic of like 1 out of every 20 children experience the death of a parent, just I was reflecting on that because I know that I felt so alone, yet there were other people, other kids experiencing the same thing, and we just had no idea. So that was like one perspective that I just, it's important for me to bring awareness on. And I think this idea of wearing blue, if like, I am imagining if I would have gone to school, you know, even the following year in November, and classmates were wearing blue in order to support, like, hey, I see you, I recognize that kids go through grief, I understand that there's a lot that happens even, you know, in as a kid in your child, you know, in your household, whether it's grief from a parent death or grief from divorce. A lot of kids experience divorce of a parent and
Mhm.
other potentially traumatic experiences that happen at home that are not talked about. So just how this movement and this Grief Awareness Day and wearing blue is really opening up the conversation to openly and compassionately talk about grief and death without it being so taboo, without it being so scary. And I really think that that's super cool. From, if I
Yeah.
would have had that support from my peers, I think I would have had a lot less social anxiety. I would have felt a lot more supported. I would have felt like I could have these conversations with my friends and with my teachers. Even the teachers had no idea how to address, how do you support
Right.
a child in grief going back to school, because studying was really hard for me. With grief brain, we know how impactful that is. So yeah, just recognizing that, you know, kids are experiencing this and that they often feel very alone, and to just recognize that is extremely powerful and important for them. Another thing that I was reflecting on was the intense inner turmoil that these kids are experiencing when they
Mhm.
are going through grief. And I think especially with kid brains, it makes the grief process really interesting and maybe more complicated, because depending on developmentally where you're at, the neurobiology of how grief is impacting your development really does form the way that your whole system, your brain, your nervous system, your body, everything, for the rest of your life, that's imprinted at an early age. So like my dad died when I was 11, and then my stepdad died when I was 15, and he died on the first day of my sophomore year of high school, and I was at school the next day. And I just remember wanting some kind of normalcy, really not knowing how to grieve. Like, I already had experienced it with my dad. I felt like
Mhm.
I just could not accept that this had happened again. And what I was experiencing internally was so complicated and nuanced and scary for me that I just did what I could to avoid it, because I had no idea how to process it. And that created so many more issues for me later in life. Now that I have to reprocess and re-grieve
Right.
or address things that I hadn't at that time. Um, but along with this social anxiety that I was feeling, amongst my peers, feeling very different from everybody else, feeling kind of isolated or othered, I was also pretty depressed. And this is something that I still experience now in my body. And I think it might have to do with the seasonal affective disorder as well. But my stepdad died in September, and then my dad died in January. So I think my body just feels the weight of that impact, and my
Yeah.
body just goes into that internal space where I just want to withdraw and isolate and sit with my grief and sit with these things that are coming up for me. Um, and another thing that has been a challenge over the years that I have awareness of now, that I certainly did not have an awareness of when I was a kid, is that as kids, you take everything personally.
Mhm.
Kids internalize what's happening because the world revolves around you. When you're trying to figure out your identity and your place in the world as a child, you take everything personally. So for me, having those back-to-back experiences of losing a father figure, I internalized this story or this belief that I am not worthy of love, that I am not good enough as a child, I am wrong in some way, and I need to prove my worth. And for me, I did that by being a good student, being a good kid in school, trying to be a perfectionist and everything else, because I felt like I had to make up for, you know, my ability to be loved because I wasn't good enough. And that
And
just
it was
came
a
out.
way of something you could control because you couldn't
Yeah.
control the death, you couldn't control the grief. It was like, I can control this part of my life.
Yes. Right. I sought a sense of normalcy. I saw it like, okay, well, I don't know how to do anything that's happening. This inner roller coaster and turmoil. Like, I have no idea what to do about that, but I know that I can do my homework and I can be a good girl for mom, so that, my mom, who is a widow, was experiencing her own grief. And, I just wanted to support the family as best as I could, even though I had my own grief. And that was a way for me to kind of do something when, yeah, like you said, there's not a lot of control elsewhere. So I just wanted to like voice that a little bit, because, and I know that this is a story that so many other people have, whether or
Yeah.
not you have a parent who has died. We struggle with self-love and self-compassion and worthiness for various reasons. But I think, especially, at least in my experience, I recognize that that was a contribution, was these early experiences. And I have a couple very distinct memories that I think cemented in that belief for me. One of them was, I remember the day that my stepdad Greg came home from, he was getting blood transfusions, and with cancer, that was the only thing that was keeping him alive at that point. And he
Mm-hmm.
came home and he walked in the door, and I was there with my mom, and he basically just announced that this is the last time he was going to do a transfusion, that he's done with it, basically that he's ready to die. And I don't even remember this moment. My mom told me that I had collapsed and fell to the floor crying, because I felt like, you don't want to fight for me anymore. I'm not worth being here. I'm not worth being around as a child. You don't want to be my dad bad enough, so you're just going to give up and die. And that was like what I internally decided
Yeah.
about that situation. And so, yeah, I'm just like later in life, like, oh my gosh, poor little Cami. I mean, she was 15 at that point, like having lost, her dad a few years before that, and just like the confusion and the grief, the enormous grief that came with that, like, and how, of course, he didn't choose that. And of course, that wasn't the truth, but that was really what I believed about myself and about him at that time. Uh, and I can just imagine how so many other kids might have that experience, as we do
Yeah.
take things so personally at that age, and with just where your brain is at developmentally, that is like a real challenge that plays out in various ways throughout your life that you may not connect to grief, but for me was very much intimately tied together.
Total abandonment, which we know is a big part of grief.
Yeah,
And we also know that it's our story. So whatever is going on out there, what we see, it's our perception is our reality. So
yeah,
perceiving that, oh my gosh, I'm not worthy enough for you to fight your life for. Oh,
yeah.
that's huge. That is so huge for a child to go through.
Yeah, and I was having a conversation about this abandonment wound with a friend of mine who, um, she did not experience the death of a parent, but she also experienced a parent who had alcoholism, so was not emotionally present for her. And she was reflecting on ways in which relationships now in her life are a struggle for her, and she's seeing all of these challenges that are coming out. And I just normalized my experience. I was like, hey, this sounds a lot like this lens of abandonment that I have also worn in relationships.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you're repeating a lot of the same patterns that I repeated and continue to repeat in some ways, that are totally around this sense of, not being worthy or feeling abandoned, how that translates into challenges in relationship, especially with men, for being, a cisgendered female in relationship with men, how my friend was totally struggling with the same thing when she has her own grief, even though nobody died. She has her own grief from not having a parent who was present
But
for
that
her.
the relationship died. The
Yeah,
family unit died, right? So there is death, right? And
yeah,
that one I relate to because I was 15, just turning 15 when my parents, my mom waited for my older brother to graduate from high school and then moved me and her up to two and a half, well, 150 miles away, leaving all my family in the Twin Cities, right? And I'm taken away, including my dad. And it was like, whoa. So I went off the rails. I didn't become the good child. I became the rebel. And it was party time. If you don't give a shit about me, I don't give a shit about what's going on here. And I'm just going to go and hang out with people. And my friends all had these same type of challenges. So we kind of
Mm.
created our own support system. We may not have done it in the most healthiest way, but for us,
Mm.
it was the way that we did it. So totally get it, and to me, all of this is grief. All of it is deep, intense grieving because it's the loss of, you know, for you though, when your parent is still alive, there's still a tangible. When your parent dies, there's not that tangible also.
Mhm.
And,
Yeah.
you can't go back and have an adult conversation, right? I could have adult conversations with my mother. I couldn't really with my dad. He died when I was in my early 30s, and we really didn't have those conversations. But with my mom, I was able to express it. I expressed it through writing,
Mm.
writing books and all that, because I needed to express that this is what happens. And it wasn't
Yeah.
anybody's fault, you
Mhm.
know, but it was my perception. I can remember my brothers getting all kind of upset about this book I wrote and my mom a bit too. And it was to honor that this is what grief does, prolonged grief does. And
Yes.
it was my perception, not yours. You all grew up in a different place,
Mhm.
and that's the same for you and all the kids in school. They're all having their own experience. And I love the Children's Grief Awareness Day. I've known about it for many years. And I just think about that blue when we go to camp, and I missed camp this year because I needed to go help my husband and go see my sister-in-law. But our children's grief camp that I have volunteered at twice a year pretty much since 2013, uh, the children are all wearing the same shirts. So they all get the same shirts. And it's like, wow, they can see that they're not alone in this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so just even that little physical thing. So if you go to school and you see a sea of blue for support, that would be pretty amazing.
Yeah, just to know that you're not alone. And the grief camps too, like when I volunteered at those grief camps, my inner child is like right there with them, like wow, like if she could have had that, and like giving that to her now as I participate in these things is so enriching for me
Yeah.
to honor that. That was another grief of like, how do you support a kid who's experienced something like this, and that requires that adults understand how to honor the grief
Yeah.
process. And we know that that is also a challenge for adults in their own grief,
Yeah.
and even harder when supporting kids. But just how that space in grief camp, just to go play and to process in the way that kids process with adults who have an awareness of, what's going on and how to support them properly, but just for kids to be around other kids so that they know that they're not alone in this is like,
Yep.
that really is such a huge impact in their life to know that you're not the weird kid because your parent died or your brother or sister died, even though it might feel like that to your normal friends who maybe have a family unit that's not broken in some way. Because I think that was also a thing that I longed for. It was like I was resentful towards my peers because they got a normal life as far as what I could
Yeah.
see, and we all have our own challenges at home. But I wanted that so bad, and I felt like I didn't get that in various ways. And I think that also created a dissonance between trying to be friends with people, because I also related to kids who had, their own challenges at home, like, oh, you get it, I can be real with you. And give kids that opportunity just to hang out with those other kids, even if you're not having
Yep.
those kinds of conversations. Like, that is super important.
So important. Yep. And I just, for me, it was kind of going off the rails and doing a bit of partying at a very young age. But, thankfully, my mom had the wherewithal to instill the values, and my dad too, but to really instill the values so that when I did get to be 18, it's like, oh, okay, that was good for a while. But now it's like, but then when you talk about, like, we talked about the control factor, I became uber controlling about my life and my
Mm.
partnerships. And, I am the alpha female because I need to have that control. And I think that all stemmed from the time of being very young and having that broken apart. And so we follow, and my mom had to be the alpha because of just the circumstances. So it's like, yes, we play out those behaviors.
Yeah.
I wanted to share with you just I'm reading a book, and I shared that with you earlier, but it was sent to me by Annie Sclaver Orenstein, and it's The Forgotten Mourner's Guide to Grief, Always a Sibling. And so I started reading this on the plane. We went to Arizona last week for a long weekend, and I just opened the book because to put it on my desk, and it opened to a page, and it was so weird because we knew we were going to talk about Children's Grief Awareness Day, right? And so she writes in this book because her brother had died in Afghanistan. So she was like in her early 20s when he died. And so she's written a whole book about sibling grief because oftentimes that's a forgotten grief, kind of, when your sibling dies, because a lot of the attention is to the parents and that type of thing. So she said some bereaved siblings, especially those who experience the loss in adolescence, delay their own grief, either intentionally or unintentionally. In some cases, the postponement of grief is the unintended consequence of adolescents trying to act normal and unemotional to maintain social connections. We were just talking about that. Driven by a desire to fit in with their peers, many will watch their parents grieve with an almost distant quality, allowing loss to be something experienced by their parents alone. So this is talking sibling loss, and I'm sure parental loss too, because like your mom, she was a widow, and so you probably could see some of that a little bit, from a different vantage point. In other cases, or in combination with fitting in, some adolescents push the grief deep down inside themselves. Frightened by the powerful emotions they feel within and see on their parents' faces, many repress their own grief because they know no other way to control and process those powerful emotions. So she said, adolescents are looking for permission to grieve, permission to not be okay, permission to talk about it, permission to not talk about it.
Mm.
So I think that was totally meant because it just opened up to that page on the book, and I'm well past that. That was page 91, and I'm on 159 right now. So it's like that was an important message to bring forth during our conversation today. And, we've talked, the death of a parent, so significant as a young child. The thoughts that were going through your mind as far as the stories you're telling yourself about yourself. I'm not good enough. I'm not valued enough. And how now, many years later, you're still processing through all of that, and I was sharing a little bit that I went to Arizona with my husband to go see his sister. His sister was hit by a car. Now, my husband said when she was 7. I asked my sister-in-law, and she said 5. She has the mentality of a 7-year-old, 6, 7-year-old. She's very childlike in her thinking patterns because the brain injury was so severe.
Mm.
And I had asked my husband, I said, what do you remember about that time? Because they don't really discuss just that she got hit by a car. Someone careened off, went up over the curb. She was playing outside in the yard, and boom.
Wow.
And he said, I can't really tell you. He said, it's all a fog. And she's 60 and he's 65, so 5 years older. So if she was 7, at 12, so maybe anywhere from 10 to 12, you would think that you would remember.
Mm.
But the trauma, and he lost his sister. He said, oh, Pat, she was the most beautiful little girl. If you see, look at the pictures of her. She was so gorgeous. And, today she's a 60-year-old that lives in a home with one other person, has caregivers, is unable to be on her own, has impulse control stuff, with the brain injury, so needs to have medication, and the I just couldn't even imagine, that's the grief that it just totally has buried for him. and their family. You know, I got tidbits when his parents were alive, but then his parents died. I've shared that before, within not even 2 weeks of each other 2 years ago. We just hit the 2-year anniversary, the end of August and early September, for both parents. And so now she's all by herself. She's grieving her mommy and daddy. I miss my mommy so bad. I miss my mom so bad. And she has no true family living in the area because we all live out of
Mhm.
state.
Yeah.
So here's this little let's say 7-year-old child in this mature woman's body who is deeply grieving her parents. And then Ken's siblings still grieving their parents and the shock of it all. And then having to go down, and you see, you know, some of the deterioration in his sister's thinking patterns and her behaviors and things
Mhm.
like that. So then you layer on some more grief, right?
Mhm.
And, you know, this sibling loss, and watching his parents, I'm sure, grieve deeply. It's shut out. He doesn't remember
Mhm.
hardly anything because all he remembers is that was his little baby sister that he took care of.
Yeah.
Boom. So how has that affected his whole life? You know, and his sister, who's, you know, a year younger than him, her whole life, and the other brother. And, you know, it's like it totally is a family, or, you know, challenge,
Mhm.
and sometimes for long periods of time. So, yeah, when we think about grief and children's grief awareness, it's the death of a parent, it's the death of a sibling, it's a death of their beloved pet, you know,
Mhm.
that they may have been with for years, you know, since they were born. It's the death of family relationships when divorce hit or estrangement happens
Yeah.
within, you know, maybe their siblings, or they're estranged from their parents. So many different things that can create such immense grief in a child's life. And, you know, as you were talking, I just thought, you need to be out there speaking at schools. You need to be educating children and their teachers. You really do. I mean, that's sorry, but I'm just like, that's where I can just see you standing in an assembly and sharing this information, because it's not out there yet. I think we're trying, everybody's trying, and grief is getting more notoriety right now, and attention and time, but we need more.
Yeah.
We need more. Like you said, if it's 1 in 20 who have lost a parent,
Mhm.
think of what the statistics are for any type of, you know, family loss, a brother, a sister, you know, niece, nephew, you name it. It's
Yes.
divorce, all of that. There are so many children. If you know, sat with 100 children in an assembly hall, just how many of those would raise their hands as they look around and say, "Me too."
Yeah. I have goosebumps. That's definitely a crowd I want to show up for, and I've been daydreaming of creating a space, a supportive space for kids who need a little extra love and attention in their early years of for me a big support for me going through just so many years of loss was the consistency of being able to go play outside and that connection with nature. And that really helped set me up for this understanding of, death does happen. I have a awareness of that from a young age, and to be able to witness that in nature was really helpful for me to see the changing of the seasons in Minnesota.
Yeah.
We get all
Yeah.
four of those seasons, and you see roadkill, and you're out playing and you see the mushrooms and things decomposing and that kind of thing. And for me, as my kid brain, having something tangible to immerse myself in not only brought me a sense of comfort, but it helped me to understand that what I was going through is actually a part of life, right? It's not something, as our culture likes to put it, something that's bad or taboo, or we try to just not think about death or grief because it's scary. And for me, nature helped me
Yeah.
going through that process. And I think that that's a beautiful playground for kids to process grief, to have their emotional expression, and to have a resource to them that's available really everywhere.
Yep.
And that's something that I'm like dreaming of, as this kids grief retreat in the woods, that we can offer some of these resources and create even just a little field trip space for some classes to come
Yep.
and
That's
just,
what I'm saying. Field trips, even just,
yes,
like, let's have this conversation out in the woods, right?
yes.
Let's go on a field trip, teachers, and, and really make this a special remembrance,
Hmm.
and help these kids to process and know they're not alone.
Yeah.
You know, to
Yes.
have to have the kids in your class don blue next Thursday. How cool. If you're a teacher listening to this, how cool would that be if you actually went to your class and say, for any of you who have experienced grief, the loss of something you really loved, wear blue. Can
Yeah.
you imagine the visual impact that would be for each other? Ooh, I
Hmm.
like that. I like that.
Yeah, that recognition goes a long way. And as teachers or as just adults in the world, as a human being, just learning a little bit more about how to support our kids and one another as adults as well, because we all experience grief at different stages of our life. Just to open up to that conversation and to be willing to go there with someone, no matter their age. I think that is really the first step to just, okay, how can we show up for one another and bring that recognition, bring that awareness, because that really is at the core of the healing, of, like you said, having that community is the healing balm for grief, no matter your age. And that's something that we can all be better at.
Yep, I agree. I agree. Wow, this
Mm.
is a very important and amazing conversation. And we just want to make sure, Cami and I, that, research a little bit more about Children's Grief Awareness Day. You'll see it. There is, a whole organization around that. Think about how you might be able to step in and support your schools, your families, your community, just raising awareness about that. Wear blue on Thursday. And people, why is everybody wearing blue? Oh,
Mm.
because. And then, because I think we're all educators in some aspect. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing this today, Cami. This was a very beautiful, an extraordinary conversation. And big hugs
Mm.
about all that you're going through, because and that's the other thing for people to know, is that when you're a child, you're going to process a certain way. When you're a teenager, you're going to process. When you're a young adult, and the older that we get, the more that we're able to really reflect, journal, think about it, we start to see things in a different light, which allows the healing to occur.
Yeah. Yeah, that awareness like you're talking about. And I think something that popped into my mind, and I kind of wanted to mention, because I forgot about it, but earlier you were talking about how you could have these conversations with your parent because they were still alive, and how later in life that was helpful for you, to process some of that with them in the loss and the grief that you experienced, and how that's harder. Obviously, when someone dies, you can't go and have those conversations. And what popped into my mind was when I was going through the Breathe program, how I think it was the week of honoring practices, and I was thinking about, oh, it was about forgiveness. Actually, it was about forgiveness. And I wrote a letter to my dad, and I remember
Mhm.
just like feeling like, I actually can have these kinds of conversations with him. Like, in my belief system, I believe that, I have a higher self and he has a higher self in his spirit, and he's very much still here with me. And I was able to connect with that version of him and feel like I was able to express a lot of my experiences to him. And that was just like so cathartic for me to have that connection with him and to
Yeah.
find a deeper sense of forgiveness and acceptance with my experiences. So I just wanted to name that, because I think even if you don't have that opportunity to go and have these kinds of conversations because the person that you need to talk to has died, there are still so many other ways that you can process and find find that sense of healing and find that sense of release, even if you're not able to like physically have a conversation with them. And
Yeah.
that's just been really cool how that's integrated into the work that we do as grief coaches to help people. That was like 13 years ago that that 13 years later, I'm still able to do this grief processing
Yeah.
because we're teaching these tools and these opportunities for support, even no matter what your age is. So I just wanted to throw that out there that if if you're a grieving kid or you were a grieving kid and now you're an adult and you feel like, wow, I have no idea how would I even start this grief process, how coaching, at least for me, going through the Breathe program have been super transformational to go back and revisit some of those things that I didn't have the chance to grieve early in life.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And we know that the program expands. And I was just thinking about one time I listened to a podcast, and it was Elizabeth Gilbert, who is the author of Eat, Pray, Love, which was back, I don't know how long ago that was, the movie and the book and everything. But her partner died. And she was on this podcast and she said, I record my messages, or I'll write them down. I'll talk to her partner. I'll ask questions. Now, do I know that she's really responding when I write down the answers or hear the answers? No, I don't know that. I can't prove that to you, but it doesn't matter because it makes me feel better.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I love that. There's so many opportunities for healing in ways that we might not fully understand, and that's totally okay.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Cami, for a wonderful session. And for everybody else, just remember, Children's Grief Awareness Month, and the day is next Thursday, the 21st. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.